Hey everyone, I'm just going to go through this presentation really fast. The DQ you have for today is meant to help you see whether you're following along or not. Also, I wanted to make sure I'm reiterating the point that the character cycle is sort of going along with the plot development. And so I'm just going to go through Nightfall really fast and allow you guys to see if what you got is the same thing that I got from the tension that's being developed and how we have sort of exposition and three major scenes. The two scenes in the middle are functioning as Act 2, where we have rising action, and then Act 3 at the end. So let's go through it real fast and just see if you get the same thing I got. So in the exposition section, we're getting the development of the characters. We start to see the beginning of the character cycle, and the tension is really being developed. For this, we need to understand that Aiton, at the very beginning of the story, is operating as everyone who's a member of this belief system is, right? So it's him, it's Sheeran, it's all the people who are built within that. And opposite them is Theramon, who is this investigative journalist. And the tension you can start to see being developed is everyone here believes something to be true. Theramon is not convinced. And so he is the cynic, he is the one coming in, questioning things. And then you have sort of Bine, who operates in this middle place because he is the one who is going to be the representative of the culture sort of responding to these beliefs. And we have, of course, the suns and the settings. But now you can start to see how that tension exists between the cynic, who is Theramon, who never knows, and the believer who always knows, or he thinks he knows, but he can never provide evidence, right? And so this is where we can get to things like Book 2 of Plato's Republic, right? We have uh, Socrates, who never really knows. He's trying to get to the bottom of things, and the other guys who always know, right? And Socrates isn't convinced. This story is going to sort of match that in that tension. We can start to see this character cycle because we have a status quo where everyone is believing this thing and this world is coming to a place. But Theramon has to want something. And a student yesterday put it this way, because I struggled to sort of articulate it. Like, he wants answers, he wants this, he wants that, but he's too selfish. So I keep comparing him to like a TMZ reporter, and what he wants is the scoop, right? You can see here from this quote, that's what he's after, right? That he's after the scoop. What happens when these guys fail? He wants that sort of notoriety to be the one to expose their failure. You can see it here that even if that's not the case, he wants to just be the one leading the propaganda charge, right? I have to make you all out to be a bunch of gibbering idiots, even though they're not. They're not gibbering idiots. They're just being irrational because of their beliefs. So that's where we get to the exposition. And the exposition really starts there because we now understand all the characters, that we're going to be looking at the beliefs of these people, that the end is coming and that the darkness is going to drive them mad. And it's really interesting because that darkness is also representative of ignorance. And you have the light of the suns that they live under all the time, which is actually making them ignorant. And that's sort of ironic and a fun way to look at this story, because the light operates to expose that, but it's overexposed. It's just sort of interesting to think about this discussion of light and dark as knowledge and ignorance. So we have to go into unfamiliar territory. We have Theramon. He is in unfamiliar territory because he is the cynic and he is surrounded by the faithful. The faithful are on unfamiliar territory, and it's not just Eaton. Remember, he's representative because they're the ones being questioned, but they're not the main character. They're not going to go through this character cycle, right? That unfamiliar territory is unfamiliar for both of them, and we're going to watch Theramon grow or not. His lack of growth could also be the point, right? And so we can start to see how that develops. But he's still going to go through this character cycle. It's not necessarily the hero's journey. So when we're mapping that, like, he's not going to come out victorious at the end. It's not going to map 1-to-1 for that character cycle. So let's go into the actual story. So Theramon's going to grow as he gets more of what he wants. He gets more of a scoop. He gets more of a story, but it's going to come at an increasing cost because the world is coming to an end before his very eyes. So the cost of his scoop, the cost is that he has to watch the world end with the people who know why it's ending, right? Like he can't be one of the masses anymore. He can't lose his mind and burn the place to the ground. In classes, if I were doing this lecture, this is where I would throw it to you guys and identify scenes where you're getting this experience. But we have a weather delay, so we will skip that. So in your rough drafts, what I'm looking for is this sort of rising tension in each scene, what's happening in each scene, and how the characters are developing, or the main characters developing in that scene. And so that could be through visual imagery or whatever. You're just outlining it in the narrative section. And as you make choices up there, you're going to want to discuss ethos, pathos, and logos in your memo, right? That's the explanation of your choices in the outline is the memo. So that's the task. Notice how I did that in exposition, right? I talked about some of the character development issues. I talked about how that exposition is setting up a place for Theramon to want something, what the status quo is, right? So from here, we're going to be looking at how Theramon deals with that through the sort of last three acts of this. So the story now is set, tension between beliefs of the observatory and the madness that will come with the setting suns, and whether this belief is a self-fulfilling prophecy, whether they're going to be driven crazy by their own beliefs. That's sort of the fun of this. So in our first rising tension, we get introduced to Sheeran, and he kind of takes the place of Eaton here, and he's going to introduce this psychological aspect. He's done quote unquote studies, right? He introduces this notion of like, oh, well, we don't really know what happened. We know that there's every 2,500 years, culture resets itself, and we've been trying to discover why. We also have this other related problem with gravity that we don't know why gravitational pull is working the way it does. It seems as if there's something we can't see pulling on our planet, which is Lagash, and that's a problem. Like we don't know what's out there, so there's this ignorance here that's very fascinating. And where does Sheeran go to get rid of that ignorance? He goes to the cult. And so not Sharon, Eaton goes to the cult in order to absolve his ignorance and get knowledge. He turns to a place of belief and not facts. And he turns to their quote unquote like holy texts, their hidden texts. And that's sort of really fascinating that he's turning to beliefs to answer rational questions. And that's where they find out that every 2,500 years, something blots out the sun. He calls it a cave, but it's very clear it's just an eclipse. Something like a planet or a moon comes between them and their furthest sun, and it blocks out their furthest sun for 12 hours. That's what we now know at the end of the story. They don't know that at the time. They just know something is going to blot out the sun, and behind the sun, there's these things called stars, and those stars drive people insane. But they don't know why. It's almost like they imagine that there's these rays of madness coming down from the stars that make people crazy. They're not acting rationally. They're thinking about the beliefs and trying to answer with beliefs. He then talks about how darkness can make one crazy. And he goes to a example at a World's Fair where at the World's Fair, people are going in the tube, and 15% of the people who went in this tube for 15 minutes in total darkness went completely insane. And he couldn't explain it, and all he could say is it was the darkness, right? And more people would sign up when they realized the chances, which sounds very much like today, where people, if you have to sign away your right to sue somebody to eat a hamburger or spicy food or to ride an amusement ride, it creates that marketing appeal, and more people wanted to go. It's also important we start to see that the scene will devolve into a he said she said if something doesn't break them out. And so as this conversation continues and we have Theramon trying to get Sheeran to give him real answers that are based in actual data, and Sheeran is just being sort of jingoistic or belligerent, like being like, no, this is how it works. We know this is how it works. Look at our sort of data and see how it works. Um, but there's never any answer. And we have to break out of that scene in order to see how, in order to get out of that conversation, because there is no resolution to that conversation. So at this point, we can look at Dan Harmon's story cycle and see what's happening here, right? So he meets Sheeran. We're now in this unfamiliar situation. He adapts to it. They're having a conversation, right? He's getting what he wants. He's getting a scoop. He's getting a story, but he's got to pay a price. He's getting more information. He cannot be a member of the masses anymore because he has too much information to just lose his mind. And then we return to that unfamiliar place because at this point in the scene, we get to the next, they're interrupted when the next people come in. And the next people are Pharaoh and Emot. And Pharaoh and Emot here, they interrupt that conversation. They're like, oh, I think they came because that conversation's going nowhere. You just have two people who don't have any answers, seeking answers and sort of digging in. And Emot and Pharaoh conducted an experiment. That experiment was they poked holes in a room, they covered the room in darkness, poked holes in the room, and then they sat in the room in complete darkness. And then after their eyes sort of adapted to that darkness, they pulled the pins on the holes so that the holes would shine light through, and those were meant to replicate stars. And they did it time and time again, and they were never driven crazy. It never happened. It's also at this point where we start to learn more about this cult. So as Farah and Emot come in, it fosters another conversation between Sheeran and Theramon, where they're getting to that devolvement because Theramon is like, your facts are wrong. Look, they conducted an experiment. It's not the darkness. There's something else here. And at the very moment when Sheeran's going to explain his, again, lack of actual, we have to remember this is like pre-Francis Bacon information. They're doing it based off of their idols and not data. And so as he's about to dig into his idols and explain it from his perspective without any real data, we meet Latimer, who comes in and he starts breaking stuff. And now we start to see how the people are adapting. And this is where we can start to see what the cost is to Theramon. Because as the people become more and more afraid, we see the violence increase. So Latimer is being violent towards the machines, and then he's jumped by 7 scientists who start beating him until Eaton comes in. So that quick movement to violence is a really key movement here that's demonstrating or foreshadowing the movement to violence that everyone is going to have. Remember, I said Binet is sort of the people of the city, and he's the one holding the guy by the throat, threatening to punch him at this very moment because he is afraid, because his stuff was destroyed. Latimer is again coming in as a cult member, and I just love this line because it demonstrates exactly the problem of their society that and the problem we have contemporarily, and it's also very much one of Isaac Asimov's main criticisms of culture. But it's about this notion that with beliefs, and notice we're not talking about any religion. The scientists have beliefs, the cult has beliefs. The only one in this story who doesn't have beliefs is Theramon. But the scientists are trying to prove the beliefs, and Latimer doesn't want those beliefs proven because then it sort of undermines this notion of faith. It also sort of undermines the very notions like of control. The cult controls the information in the people, but if the scientists come in and start proving the faith tenets correct, they may lose that control. And so here we see They've captured Latimer. I asked him, continued Eaton angrily, for data only the cult could supply, and it was given to me. For that, thank you. In return, I promised to prove the essential truth of the creed of the cult. And the cult member just says, there's no need to prove it. It's proven by our book, by our holy book. And so you can start to see how that rationality versus faith is operating here in a really interesting way. But then we come out of this conversation and out of this because the eclipse has started. And that's sort of the climax of the story, because we now know the eclipse is real, right? The news breaks, the prophecy being fulfilled. And now we can start to see that adaptation coming to play, because everyone else is losing their mind. But because Theramon has been here, he's been one of them, he's been skeptical. He can't let go. He can't be one of the masses like John or like Bernard, right? Like he knows something different and he can't be one of them. And so this is where that comes in. And we can now go back to those experiments and ask ourselves, why didn't the darkness make Pharaoh and Emot crazy? And why did the darkness only make 15% of the people in the tunnel crazy? What is really happening here? And what about like these discussions of him making an article on Sunday? Like, what are we really making of this? And I'd really like you to think about it. You could pause this video now and think about, like, what do you really think is the point here? Because darkness made 15% of people in the tunnel crazy. Darkness did not make Emot and Pharaoh crazy. So what is it that's really driving this? So you can pause it here and think about it, but I'm going to continue. So remember, we talked about ignorance versus knowledge, and in my opinion, for me, this story is very much about ignorance is what drives us crazy, or the sort of total ego collapse of unveiling our ignorance is what drives us crazy. These people had believed they knew their world forever. For 2,500 years, they thought they knew what their world looked like. And for the first time in 2,500 years, they realized that they didn't know their world even a little bit. Here we can see in the first quote I'm pulling out, it's Aiton talking about their world. I don't know how much you guys know about our universe, our galaxy, but Earth is like in a very small part of the universe. Like we're almost out in the outer edges. We're in a very good part of the universe for life. But Lagash is much closer to their galactic center. And because they're much closer, their night sky is filled with bright stars. That's where he says, not Earth's feeble 3,600 stars visible to the eye. Lagash was in the center of a giant cluster. 30,000 mighty suns shone down in a soul-searing splendor that was more frighteningly cold in its awful indifference than the bitter wind that shivered across the cold horb. So they're looking up at the sky. They thought there were 6 stars, the stars that they sort of rotated around. It turns out they're in a giant cluster of stars, that they're much smaller than the world they thought they lived in. I often will equate this to, like, imagine you took somebody from, the Ptolemaic universe, the universe where we believed, the Ptolemaic universe, where we believed that we were the center of all things, and then bring them to today where they're like, we're not, like, let's show you James Webb Space Telescope imagery and think about how that might affect their mind. Because that's what these people are going through in 20 minutes, is essentially being confronted with, from Ptolemaic universe, we're the center, everything revolves around us, to look at how small we are in this giant, beautiful place. But it just makes them collapse. And we can start to see it in the next one, where Aiton somewhere was crying, whimpering horribly, like a terribly frightened child. Stars, all the stars, we didn't know it all. We didn't know anything. We thought 6 stars in the universe is something. The stars didn't notice this darkness forever and ever and ever, and walls were breaking in, and we didn't know. We couldn't know. And anything, the torch goes out. And the people, driven mad by the knowledge of their own ignorance, the knowledge that they had been wrong for so long, driven mad by that very fact, are burning the world to the ground. And it happens once every 2,500 years. Now, for our world, we can start to think about how when we don't like information, when we hear data that doesn't comport with our view of the world, how we want to burn things to the ground. That, when we hear statistics that are in challenging our worldview, we want to fight them like these people are fighting Theramon. And that if we're ever confronted with that, we want to burn it all down. And that's really what Asimov is getting to here, and that's where that tension resolved. I hope you guys like this story. I hope you guys have a good long weekend, and I will see you guys in a few weeks. Just remember that in each scene, what we want the scene being developed, what's happening in the scene. So you would have things like this, and then you'd also include the story cycle where we would be talking about, well, he's now entering an unfamiliar situation because these guys actually tested the theory. He's adapting to it by asking these questions. He's getting the scoop, right? When he confronts Sharon and he's like, what do you make of your theories now? But because he's that cynic, the heavy price he's going to pay is going to come due in a few pages. And so every scene, you're going to do both of those things. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, just let me know, and I will get back to you as soon as I can.